Cuphead is a video game where you play as a guy who has a teacup for a head, and I'm gonna convince you why this game is awesome. Cuphead is a run and gun game created by the geniuses over at Studio MDHR. It was actually the first game they developed, and damn, that's a good first impression. The game started development in 2010, and the studio was working hard until 2017 when the game was finally released. And upon its release, it was praised as being one of the best games of the year, with fun gameplay that really challenges you, and beautiful art direction that takes inspiration from the golden age of animation. As someone who has played Cuphead, I can indeed confirm this game is a genuine masterpiece. Now join me as I go on a review as to why I believe this game deserves to be held in such high regards. We can start by talking about the story in Cuphead. The game follows Cuphead and his brother Mugman, two brothers who have cups for head. And okay, these designs raise serious questions about how their anatomy works, but let's not get into that. One day, the two brothers wander away from their home and find themselves in the Devil's Casino as they go on a winning streak. That's when the devil himself offers them a deal. If they win, they could obtain all the goods in the casino, but if they lose, they'll have to forfeit their souls. Cuphead, blinded by the chance of becoming rich, accepts the offer and unfortunately loses. They beg the devil not to take their souls and they make another deal. If Cuphead and Mugman can collect the souls of their runaway debtors, he'll spare them. So you'll have to travel all across Inkwell Isle fighting these wacky characters to get their souls to not lose your own. Survival of the fittest, in other words, kill or be killed. After the opening cutscene, the story takes a back seat, which is expected and perfectly fine. One of the reasons why the story is so simplistic is a callback to the games the Moldenhauers grew up playing that were lacking in the story department. Also, I'm sorry if I butchered that name. Also, I love how Cuphead being in dread after gambling his life away represents the themes of the Great Depression, which was a thing around the time the style of animation featured in Cuphead was popularized. Speaking of animation, I think it's time we talk about this game's art direction, which is probably the game's most defining trait. The presentation in Cuphead is nothing short of beautiful. This is easily one of the best looking games I have ever seen in my life. The characters are so expressive and there are so many frames of animation. And man, some of these guys have really cool designs. I seriously respect Studio MDHR for all the hard work they put into the art alone for this game. They had to hand draw everything frame by frame, and I salute them for how much effort and hard work they put into it. Plus, it's just beautiful in general. The art style also takes inspiration from the cartoons in the 1920s. It was influenced by the cartoons the Moldenhauers grew up watching. This kind of animation is called rubber hose animation. One of its most defining traits is the characters that have limbs that are similar to rubber hoses. A concept that was once rooted in cutting costs ended up paying off greatly since it allows characters to be more expressive than ever before. This style of animation just has such a cool aesthetic, and I found it to be very fun to learn about. The sound design also delivers with a beautiful soundtrack. The main genres featured are jazz, ragtime, and big band. I don't see a lot of games incorporate these genres, and I'm really glad this game does this to not only stand out, but just produce some banger songs in general. I highly recommend you go onto YouTube or any other music streaming site and giving it a listen for yourself. And what's even cooler about the soundtrack is how it incorporates music genres that are popular during the Great Depression, like jazz. And what's even cooler about Cuphead is that you can even play it! Like I said in the story part of this review, the goal in Cuphead is to fight different creatures that owe the devil and collect their soul contracts. Just like every other aspect of the game, Cuphead's gameplay was inspired by the games from the 80s and 90s. Mainly those run and gun games where your goal is to reach the end of the stage and kill as many enemies as you can. You know, games like Contra, Mega Man, and Gunstar Heroes to name a few. One of the most defining traits of this genre of retro games is how they would kick your ass hard, but admittedly, the feeling you get when you finally beat the level was very rewarding. This aspect stays true in Cuphead. The levels will test your endurance and ability to precisely evade enemy attacks and quickly react to incoming obstacles. Cuphead has a few different abilities besides just jumping and shooting that you can take advantage of. You have the dash maneuver that can boost you forward, which is great for dodging attacks and correcting jumps. You also have the parry slap, which can parry projectiles and other objects, as the name suggests. The act of parrying requires you to push the jump button when Cuphead is close to a parryable object, which then allows you to bounce off of it and the object will disappear. You'll know whether or not something is parryable by its pink color. Trying to parry objects is kind of like a risk-reward system. It's a risk because you have to get up close and personal to your target and time it right, with failure resulting in you taking damage. The reward is that not only can you bounce off of it, which can be used in platforming sequences, but successfully parrying something will fill one of these cards that build up your super meter. This gauge can be built by parrying objects and damaging enemies. Using one card shoots a strong projectile that is unique to whatever weapon you have equipped, and pressing the button with all 5 cards in stock will unleash one of your 3 super arts. These can be unlocked by completing the Mausoleum stages. Completing one rewards you with a super art, and they're all different. I mostly just use the first one since it does massive damage, but you can't move when doing it and you have no invincibility frames, so I counted a few times where I take damage right after using it for something that was out of my control. The game has 3 different types of stages: run and gun levels, ground boss levels, and flight boss levels. Okay, well I guess you could group the last 2 as one type, but they're different enough in my book. We'll start with the former. The run and gun levels are the most similar to the retro games I mentioned earlier, where your goal is to reach the end of the stage by doing some platforming as well as fighting waves of enemies. These levels are the ones that actually get the least attention, which I actually found to be a bit disappointing. I think all of the run and gun stages are really fun, and every stage has some sort of gimmick or set piece to call their own, like the anti-gravity in Funhouse Frazzle or the part with the Cyclops in Rugged Ridge. The hardest run and gun levels aren't as hard as the hardest boss levels though, which really isn't a criticism, since I think they can be fairly challenging in their design, but I still thought those stages were really fun. They weren't the highlight of the game, but I wish there were more, frankly. The next type of stage in Cuphead is the boss levels, where instead of reaching the end of the level, your goal is to simply survive and defeat the boss of the level. These stages come in two different types, the ground ones and the airplane ones. I think the difference between the two is self-explanatory. All of the bosses have very distinct designs and attack patterns, which I greatly appreciate, since it makes every boss feel distinct and fresh on top of their unique attack patterns. But hot damn, this game sure does put up a challenge.
Well, no fucking shit.
This game will kick your ass, there is no doubt about that one. The key to success is memorizing enemy attack patterns to react quickly. Trial and error, in other words, which was pretty common in the retro game that inspired Cuphead. Fortunately, there are rarely any times where death wasn't my fault. This game has many things, but it definitely isn't unfair. Enemies will commonly have animations that telegraph the fact they're about to attack, so you'll know to be prepared. Failure is merely an opportunity for improvement, and seeing that progress bar right after dying does a great job of making you want to keep on playing, cause come on, I was so close! I can't just leave it at that, I have to keep on going until the boss who's boss. They always have a few different phases that you'll have to memorize, but on average, bosses will last from 90 to 150 seconds, which really isn't a lot. This is great, since the short phases let you memorize the ins and outs of their patterns a lot faster, and you'll be back to where you died in no time. Bosses may be really short, but don't be too surprised if you take up to 30 minutes on a singular boss. You'll really have to perfect all their attack patterns if you want to rise up to the challenge of beating this game. There are a few bosses that are exceptions to the bosses usually being short. The King Dice boss requires you to roll this die to progress, and there are 9 little mini bosses that are pretty simple to memorize, but I can excuse the length of this fight because it is the penultimate boss. This one may have taken me a while, but I still think it's one of my favorites. But man, the Phantom Express took me forever, dude. My winning attempt was nearly 4 minutes because of how long it goes on. It's all because of his first phase. He throws eyeballs at you that are right in front of him, so trying to hit and throw the eyeballs can make it go on for a while. My best method was parrying all the objects I could to use my super art, but even then, it would take me 2 or 3 of them to finally kill him on that phase. The second type of bosses you'll encounter are the airplane ones. Structurally, they're basically the same as the ground boss level, since you're fighting a boss with multiple phases containing unique attack patterns. But in case it wasn't obvious enough, the gameplay itself is very different. You control Cuphead piloting an aircraft, meaning the boss usually takes place somewhere in the sky. Cuphead's moveset in the plane levels has seen some varying as well. You obviously can't jump, but can still parry objects. Your super arts are completely different, and you can also shrink in size. It gives you a smaller hitbox but weaker damage. This form will mostly just be used for quickly dodging projectiles. Like if you know that you may not be able to dodge, you can quickly shrink yourself to squeeze through, but it is very useful. These stages adopt more of a bullet hell approach to gameplay because, well, look at them. I think the plane stages do a great job of offering a change of pace for the bosses, but there are some I hated. I'm looking directly at you, Dr. Cal with Junkyard Jive, specifically the phase before the bullet hell. God, this part was so hard because of how many things there were to keep track of, dude. To deal damage, you'll have to target specific parts of the body, which allows for a lot less wiggle room and forces you to get up close and personal with a bunch of projectiles. And there's these hands that'll violate your personal space, and just for shits and giggles, you might throw in a magnet occasionally that'll fuck with your precision. Oddly enough, the following phase, yeah, this, is actually pretty easy. You're following the same pattern over and over again, and I managed to beat it the first time I got to it, at least on this playthrough. In the hub world, there's a shop where you can buy items or the coins you can collect in the run and gun levels. They're like the dragon coins from Mario World, being scattered across the level, and they usually require you to take some risk or find a secret to get to it, or just be in plain sight. In the stores, you can buy weapons to customize your projectiles, and charms that are like upgrades you find in a roguelike. The weapons you can unlock include the spread, which has pretty bad range but can shred enemies when you're up close. The roundabout that acts as a boomerang you can shoot in the opposite direction you're facing. The chaser that can home onto enemies and is pretty fast. The charge shot that requires you to charge your shots but is honestly devastating. And the lobber, I never really found that useful. Your projectiles bounce around, which can be hard for precision, and I feel like the range is just too short. If I ever need a close range weapon, I'll just stick with the spread or charge. So I can't really think of specific times where I'd need the lobber, which is something I can't say about every other weapon. They'll all be useful in some way. The roundabout can be good for scenarios where you're being chased. The spread is really good for bosses that'll have you close to them. The chaser is just all around a good weapon. Since its homing function lets you move around freely, the lobber is most useful for being useless. And the charge shot works for about every scenario, so I'd say this one is my favorite. The charms basically serve as upgrades you can equip, such as giving you more health, making your jumps automatically turn into a parry slap, or make your parry slaps a weapon, and the smoke bomb, which is definitely my favorite one. It makes you invisible when dashing, which is great since you can just straight up phase through objects. But since you're invisible, it is really hard to predict where you're gonna land at times. I mean, most of the time in video games where your player is invisible, they aren't actually invisible since you as the player can see them. And let's be honest, having an actual invisible player would be a nightmare. Maybe making Cuphead's transparency really low when doing the dash could have helped with letting you actually predict where you'll land, but I'll be honest, it wouldn't look as cool to perform. But I'm not really a fan of how the shop itself works, to be honest. There's only a limited amount of items on display at any given time, so to have more appear, you'll have to buy more items, which means sometimes you will be forced to buy something you don't really care about just to get something you want. There are just enough coins in the game to let you buy everything, but I just don't really like this method. Maybe once you unlock a new world, then some more items will be unlocked. I think that would make a lot more sense. If you like post-final boss content in video games, then you're in luck since Cuphead has a fair amount of things to do. After beating the game, every boss will now unlock an expert mode that has harder attack patterns that aren't just extra damage. Sometimes it'll combine multiple attacks into one. There's even a ranking system for you to invest your time into. To get the best possible rank, you'll have to not take any damage, parry as many things as you can, and perform a lot of supers, on top of doing it moderately fast. It may seem like a lot, but most of my winning attempts were B's and A-minuses. There's also the pacifist rank, exclusive to the run and gun levels. They require you to not kill a single enemy, and trust me, it's a lot harder than it sounds. You get this black and white filter for getting P ranks on all the stages, which I guess is cool, but dude, just use the normal filter. I don't really see a point in making the game look worse besides the fact that they even added it being cool. In conclusion, Cuphead is nothing short of a brilliant game that just gets literally everything right. The story, even as minimalistic as it is, represents themes from the time period it comes from. The presentation is not only mesmerizing, but also pays homage to the rubber hose animation from the 30s, which I think is really cool. The gameplay calls back to the tough as nails video games from the 80s and 90s on top of being fun to learn, very rewarding, and multiple ways to approach bosses with the items from the store. And the soundtrack also features genres from the same time period as the animation, and it's just awesome anyway. Cuphead is a great example of a game that is heavily inspired by other things from the past, but still manages to carve its own identity with the characters and the combination of old school run and gun games with the themes from the Great Depression like in the animation and story. Cuphead is a masterpiece that I can definitely recommend to most people who like video games, especially if you like a game that'll kick your ass hard. I know it isn't for everyone, but I still implore you to give it a shot. If it makes you feel any better, I'm not very good at video games, but I decided to see the game through since I loved it that much and wanted to get better at the game. I even beat it twice, once last year and another for this video. Anyways, look at your calendars everyone, Halloween is coming soon. I guess that means it's time to take a look at a spooky game, so I'll see y'all on the 31st.